Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. In this episode, we will continue our exploration of epilepsy, and on this occasion, we'll be looking at the patient perspective. I'm joined today by Franziska Thomas, who narrated her experience of epilepsy in her illness memoir titled Fits and Starts, a memoir of living with epilepsy. In Fits and Starts, Franziska gives a compelling personal description of living with epilepsy, an illness which she said is shrouded in secrecy and antiquated myths. Since she had her first seizure in 1992, she said her whole world literally turned upside down, and we'll explore this in the podcast. She describes Fits and Starts as a story not just of her seizures, but also of injuries and of memory loss. And she sees it as a memoir set within the wider story of epilepsy and society. As a background, Franziska has previously worked as a journalist and a history teacher. She's currently working as an author and GCSE English tutor. And she lives in London with her husband, Tim, their children, Oscar and Kurt. Which of them helped this morning to start?
Oscar, that's the older one.
Oscar, thank you for saving the day. Two misbehaving Maine Coons and a Labrador called Magnus, who never stops eating, eating out of the house, I presume. Franziska Thomas, welcome to the Neurology Lounge podcast, and I'm very grateful you could spare time for this.
Thank you very much.
So, I suppose people have different reasons why they write books. In your case, why did you decide to write about your personal journey with epilepsy and your personal life as well?
It was a story that needed to be told, and nobody had said anything about it. I've spent my life fighting with my illness. I've been very lucky in the sense that I come from a family of medical practitioners. My mother was a nurse, my father a doctor. Yeah. So I was everything was explained to me from the very beginning what epilepsy was about, and certainly from my perspective, I wasn't scared of epilepsy. But what I wasn't prepared for was everyone else's reaction to the epilepsy. And I never really came to terms with the fact that people don't like looking at mess. And I think that's especially true for English people. They don't like messiness. And when you have epilepsy, you are very, very messy in every conceivable way. You have seizures which make you fall to the floor. You have blood. You're incontinent. You're bleeding from the mouth. You're bleeding from the head. You're bleeding. It's just messy in every conceivable way. There's nothing about it which isn't messy. And even taking the medication is messy. You're stumbling backwards and forwards. The number of times I'm being told the whole time, people like you shouldn't have children. People like you shouldn't, why you're drunk. I'm not drunk. I haven't had a drink since I was 19 years old. Let's just say between you and me, I'm in my mid-40s. I certainly haven't had a drink for a long, long time. But the fact that people immediately assume that you're drunk or high is very, very upsetting. And of course, these are all things that Oscar and Kurt, the elder son that especially the elder son that you've just met, have had to put up with all of their lives. People coming up to them saying, your mother is drunk, you shouldn't have to put up with this. Do you want me to call social services? Do you want me to do this? Do you want me to? And them just turning around and saying, would you leave her alone? She is not drunk. She is having a fit, and them getting extremely agitated about the whole thing and not really knowing what to do. And over time, they've got better at it as they've got older.
Yes,
they've become more. They've become better at knowing what to do about it, and I think they've become better at, more relaxed at it. And there was an incident about maybe 6 months ago, 7 months ago, where Oscar was particularly upset because somebody tried to film me when I was having a seizure. And Oscar got very upset by it, and he couldn't understand why I wasn't upset. And I just sort of said, well, look, these people, you're going to come across these people. You can't change them. The good news is that you get to go home at the end of the day, and you get to go home to your life, and you say goodbye to them, and you never have to see them again. And that's the end of that. And you close your door. And that's all you can do. But you can't carry that anger with you, because if you carry that anger with you, that just makes you an angry person. And that's the reason why I started writing the book, because there was a message that needed to be said, and somebody needed to say it, and there was no one else to say it. So I started when, I think Kurt must have been about, I think originally he was a couple of months old when I first started writing it. I put a couple of chapters together, and then I just carried on. I kept a diary form of it, and the first I wasn't expecting it to do particularly well, and then it did complete the opposite. It took off completely, and it won so many different awards, and which just proves the fact that actually it was something that had to be done and something that had to be said, and there were people there who were waiting for someone to say something. And I've been getting all of these emails from people saying things like, I've been wanting to say something to my husband for the last 10 years, and I haven't told him I have epilepsy. And you sit there thinking, you haven't told your husband you have epilepsy? How can you not tell him you have epilepsy? I mean, it's your husband. And but then now we've come to a point where we want to have a child, and I can't not tell him anymore, because I keep giving him different reasons as to why we can't have children. And of course, he doesn't know the reason why we don't have children is because I can't take any medication because I have epilepsy. And people have all these different reasons as to why they can't they can't tell their spouses why they don't, why they haven't told their spouses because the reason that they don't have epilepsy, or that this thing in this that their life is shrouded in this secrecy. And I thought that fits and starts should be completely the opposite, that actually you should just literally stand up and be counted, and do completely the opposite. And that as somebody with epilepsy, you should just stand up and say, no, actually, I refuse to do that. I'm going to say no to that, and you can say whatever you want, but that's not the way it's going to be. I'm going to do it this way. So, and that's the reason why I did it.
So you're kind of affirming your right to be in the space, isn't it? You're not epilepsy.
Yeah, I think it's a lifetime of always needing to feel that you were apologizing for something. I've spent 30 years apologizing for something that, quite frankly, I shouldn't have been apologizing for. and I think that was what Fits and Starts originally started off with, was to make sure that I wasn't apologizing anymore.
It's interesting. I mean, that brings out so many things. One, in the 21st century, there's still that gross misunderstanding of epilepsy. And then the perspective of, I think is a perspective of stigma I haven't thought about, which is people see it just as messy rather than stigmatize about work or other things. It's just this messiness. I've never seen epilepsy in that perspective, as people can see it as messy.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of people see it as messy. I mean, especially as someone, if you have a child, you see it in a different way, because you have a child that nobody wants to play with because nobody wants to play with your child. You have someone who you're you're well educated, you've got the right job, you've done this and you've done that, and you've done all the right things, and still at the end of the day your child is not going home to play with anyone. And it's very, very difficult to walk around the streets with two black eyes and a split lip, and have and be able to walk around and say, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with looking like this, and I'm okay with you staring at me like this. So you can look away, and I'm okay with that. It's taken me a long time for me to get to that point, but it's it it and I think it took a long time for me to get there, because it's now that Oscar and Kurt are old enough to understand that. Oscar and Kurt, when they were younger, I was much more worried about it, because I was much more worried about what they thought. Yeah. So I was always constantly sort of protecting them and making sure that they were okay. And in actual fact, in a way, possibly overprotecting them a little bit, and making life a little bit more difficult for them than possibly it had to be. My tonic-clonic fits are much worse now than they ever were before. Yeah. But which means that a lot of the time I look a lot worse now than I have done before. And you have to be okay to be able to walk around the streets with a couple of black eyes and split lip, and everyone just going, oh, it's okay, she looks like that all the time, and just and take it with no pun intended, take it on the chin and just go, it's okay, it's fine.
And did writing the book help you to reach that stage of
No, strangely enough, it didn't actually. But it did. It helped a lot, in the sense that it brought a lot of closure, and helped a lot of other people, I think, as well. And it brought epilepsy to the front of a lot of things, which it hasn't done before. It's not a glamorous illness, is it? I mean, it's not something that comes to the front. It's not like cancer. It's not an illness where you naturally assume that people will think of it and go for it immediately, and support it, and you don't have Hollywood stars supporting it and walking 100 miles for it or anything like that. There's nothing sexy or glamorous or anything else about it. It's just there, and it's never ending.
So, I mean, there's a lot written by experts about epilepsy, but quite often the patient perspective is not really heard, as you said, which is the reason I found your book quite interesting. So going back to when it started, you first started having fits at the age of 15. What happened then? How did it start manifesting?
I was at home one morning going to the orthodontist. It was 6 weeks before my GCSEs started, and I remember going into the bathroom, and I was it was 11 o'clock in the morning. I went to brush my teeth. I'd just taken the braces off my teeth. And that's the last thing I remembered. I don't remember anything else about it. I don't remember anything else about that day at all. The last thing I remember was throwing up in the back of an ambulance. I don't remember anything else about that day. And then I was taken to King's in London. And it started from there. I had that one seizure, and then I didn't have anything for about a month. And then it just sort of took off. It literally just took off. And it didn't stop. And it went from doing absolutely nothing to just day and night. The first medication I took was Tegretol retard, which was, of course, given to me right before my GCSEs, which made me sleep the whole time. And then I was given lamotrigine, and I just remember wanting to sleep. That's all I did the whole time, was wanting to sleep. And now I'm still on those two medications, along with 3 other medications. So I take 5 anticonvulsant medications. But I still I have somewhere between 30 to 40 partial fits a day, and then I have when I have my menstrual cycle, I have a lot of tonic-clonic fits as well. So I have a lot of different kinds of seizures. So they don't. I mean, it doesn't. The thing is I know that if I don't take my medication, I'd be a lot worse off. So I take my medication, because if I don't take it, I'd be a lot worse off than I am now. But at the same time, it's inconceivable where I'd be without it.
Did your doctors explain to you why you have so many different types of seizures? Or why your seizures are so frequent? Did you?
No, it's something to do with frontal lobe epilepsy, and where it is in the brain. You're not necessarily told in any great depths or validation. You're just explained, that's it, and that's the end of it, sort of thing. There was a time where I felt that I wanted to know more about it, where I wanted to know more about it. I wanted to come to terms with it, and I wanted to understand it. And then I sort of realized that actually understanding it didn't really bring me anything. All it did was made me more scared. I had a fit in Tottenham Court Road Station at midnight about 5 years ago, and some people on the underground pulled me off the train and laid me on the station platform. And for about 3 years afterwards, all I kept thinking was, you do understand that if I'd had a fit 3 minutes earlier, I'd be dead. Because Tottenham Court Road Station is vertical. I mean, it's vertical. So I made it down to the bottom of Tottenham Court Road Station. I made it into the underground, and I made it onto the seat. And that's all I remember. If I had that fit a couple of minutes earlier, I wouldn't be here sitting talking to you. So it's things like that you almost don't want to know about your condition. You're almost better off not knowing about your condition, because the more you know about it, the more you realize there is to fear about it, and the less you are afraid of it, the more you can come to terms with it. And I think that's a lot to be said about that. to be able to walk out the front door and walk to the end of the road, cross the road, and then keep walking, because it's a very, very scary thought not being able to go out your front door and go to the end of the road because you're too scared to cross the road.
You have to strike a balance, isn't it? Otherwise you will not.
Well, otherwise you just become terrified, don't you? And you don't, it's a bit like living in a war-torn country, isn't it?
Yeah, it's difficult choices. We tell patients with epilepsy not to swim or climb heights, but there's
exactly. I mean, those are the obvious things you do. When you don't do things like swimming and climbing heights and doing things. But I mean, there are some things you just can't do anything about. I live in central London, and if you don't drive, you're going to end up on a bus or on a train, and that's just the way it goes, unless you end up in a house and don't ever leave the house, and you can't do that. I had a EEG done, and they said to me, yeah, you'll see that you have a lot of fits during the day. You'll have fits all through the day. And then they came back to me and they said, actually, we have to be honest, I mean, it looks like you're pretty much having fits all day, every day. That's all you do. You just fit all day, every day. So you must be absolutely exhausted. And I was like, yeah, I'm pretty tired. And he was like, yeah, that's because you literally just do nothing but fit all day, every day. So, I mean, and that's, of course, on top of the medication, is the reason why, you do this kind of constant. And of course, people don't realize that when they first meet you. They sort of look at you a little bit going, okay, she's a little bit on the strange side. Just, not really the best conversation starter when you first get to know someone. It's like, yeah, I've got twitches and this and that and the other, and I don't finish sentences, and I can't find my words, and all these kind of things. But you just want to give people an option, first of all, to actually get to know you before you start giving them the sort of, by the way, I'm likely to fall down mid-sentence and you won't actually have a clue what to do with me.
You did give me a heads up. 11 o'clock was your best time. So we're getting at your best time. So hopefully we'll get through the podcast. You talked about when you are transferred from a pediatrician, you needed to go to an adult doctor, and you were taken on by this Machiavellian psychiatrist with an interest in epilepsy.
Oh God, he was horrible. Yeah.
And he doubted whether you had epilepsy. Was it because you were having so frequent episodes, or?
I think that was partly part of it. I actually think part of it was it was the number of seizures I was having, and I think it was the time as well of the age that I was having them. Okay. They talk about non-epileptic seizures, don't they? The NES. And I went to see a very well-known doctor yesterday, who was talking to me about NES being something completely different in itself, a completely different thing. But I get asked quite a lot whether I have NES.
Yeah.
And non-epileptic seizures, and I think it is literally because of the sheer number of seizures I have. I think it's quite a few. I think doctors literally can't get their head round the idea that somebody could have gone this long without having been treated successfully for epilepsy. And also, how could you have fallen through the gaps for this long? And there must be something psychiatrically wrong with you. And then but you do almost feel like getting out your EEG, saying, as you can see here, you're just like, why am I doing this? This is ridiculous. But I mean, you don't have to do it if you have cancer. I mean, if you have cancer, you don't sit there saying, oh, by the way, I have a tumor just here. Can you see the tumor? There you go, right there. Can you see the tumor? But you just sit there thinking, you do that. You do literally sit there thinking, I'm validating the fact that I have epilepsy, which is insane. I spend a lot of time at A&E with doctors putting postscripts on notes. I see them write it on the notes saying likely NES, most likely NES, where is medication, you know, all this kind of stuff. And I'm sitting there going, I've got my medication, I'm giving you my medication. Yeah, but is this actually your medication or is it someone else's medication? You're like, no, it's my medication. And then my husband comes and says, I've got her medication here, there's medication. He goes, yes, but is it actually her medication? It's her medication. Goes, but do you see her take it? Like, yes, but of course I see her take it. It's I live with her, it's her husband, it's her medication. And they're looking at him going, yes, I know, but when was the last time you saw her? And he's sort of looking at them going, I see her have fits all the time. I mean, she's an epileptic. Really? Really? And you're just sort of looking at them going, I can't have this conversation. I can't. You really feel like you're going to scream. I mean, you just go round and round in circles. You don't ever feel like you're getting anywhere. You just, you know, you're not getting anywhere. You're just going in the same, you know, loop that you're not really going anywhere.
But you did have this extended EEG, so your neurologist knows, but it's usually the
Queen Square know, which is great. But of course now we have the same problem that obviously, you know, you're aware of in the UK, is that the hospitals are all on separate streams here in the UK. So Queen Square is the one that I is my hospital, but A&E, the hospital I go to, is King's. But King's, as far as they're concerned, I don't have epilepsy because I left there in 2010 because my neurologist retired. So I left in 2010 and I went to Queen Square. And of course, as far as they're concerned, I left in 2010 and I was cured because, you know, I didn't go back. I've got a wonderful doctor there. He's absolutely fantastic. And he keeps writing them letters, but it never gets to where it's supposed to go. It always gets filed somewhere else. So he's written about 6 letters, and every single time it gets sent somewhere else at King's. Okay. And every single time I get admitted to hospital at King's, there's somewhere else that gets sent to at King's. And he goes, oh, I sent him a letter here, and I sent him a letter there. You know, and it's absolutely hysterical. So you have all these little streams, you know, and it's absolutely, and I understand why people go round with their medical files. And of course, now I'm a little bit older and a little bit wiser. I've got exactly the same thing. I've got a file
that you carry along,
which has just got all my medical files in it. So as soon as anything happens, I literally just give it to you and just go, here you go. It's my name, my actual age, by the way, which is not going to go any further. And then, you know, and then it's really interesting though, because it's I think it's the thing that needs to be changed the quickest in the NHS is the fact that we are all on these separate streams that people with chronic illnesses just can't get past. That you know, once you're on a stream, you can't go from one stream to the next.
You are told when you first had epilepsy that it wasn't going to change anything, but clearly it has had a lot of impacts on you.
Yeah.
One of them is you had to leave journalism to go into teaching. What was it about journalism that made it more difficult for you to function, and about teaching was better?
It was the 2 o'clock backbench deadline. So I worked for The Guardian, and we had what's called a 2 o'clock backbench deadline. Backbench deadline. I can't even say it. We had a 2 o'clock backbench deadline, and it's that sort of knowing that 2 o'clock is coming up, you know, and that time is coming, and that time is coming, and that time is coming, and I wasn't somebody who made her choice at the age of 5 and sort of wanted that from the very beginning. The only thing that I was ever any good at was working with children.
Okay.
And I needed some kind of security, I think, with my epilepsy. I needed something that made me a little bit easier to function. Okay. And I think working in inner city schools with children who had problems much, much worse than I could possibly even begin to imagine, where my epilepsy seemed really quite pathetic in comparison. That made my life a lot easier. The only problem is that it's a very, very physical job, that job. And I couldn't continue it after the birth of my children, simply because I couldn't continue it on a physical level.
And did you find children more understanding or accepting of people with?
They were surprising. Yeah. They were surprising. There were some students who, there are a lot of students who, my nan's got that kind of thing. Okay. You had a lot of that. I was always very open about it. I certainly wasn't about to shy away from it. I got a lot of, my nan's got that, my granddad's got that. Oh yeah, my granddad's got it when he drinks. Are you drunk as well? And I'm just sort of like, no. But it's nice of you to mention that. Thanks for that. It's like, it's always because quite often associated with alcohol, and you're just standing there going, no, I definitely no, thank you very much. But then they do strange things, like, all club together and give £2 each. My first tutor group gave £2 each to buy me a pillow, so that when I had a fit, I didn't hit my head on the floor.
One of the things you talked about quite extensively, again, going back to the issue of stigma, which you actually researched very well, and quite impressed with that. You talked about the 6 dimensions of stigma, which I had never heard about. Can you explore that and how that correlates with your experience of stigma?
The idea on stigma came initially because the head teacher of my children's school gave me a wanted list, as it were, and on that piece of paper it said, Fran, if you see Fran having a fit, this is what you need to do. But it was written in such a way where it was really, really uncouth and really, really very, very, very rude, actually. It was just not particularly pleasant. And I don't think they meant it in a nasty way. It was just immediately assumed that I wouldn't be able to string a sentence together. So, and I just remember being quite shocked finding this piece of paper. And she said, well, I thought it would be rather useful for you that if you had a fit, and it said, do not approach if you have a fit. And I just thought, do not approach if you have a fit. I'm not nuclear. I'm not going to blow up. It was the idea of this, and that it's that idea of, when it came to the idea of stigma that people have with their opinion on how they see people and how they see others and how others see them, is that you don't see people in the same way. You see what you want to see. And I think that's the most important thing about judgment, isn't it? Is that you see what you want to see, and what you want to see is always very, very different to actually what comes out. As a result of that, I ended up doing a lot of research on the sixth sense of stigma, and how you can actually learn to live with it, and how you can learn to teach others on how to live with it, and how do I teach you on how to deal with me with it, because we have to all get along somehow together. And it was a really, really interesting idea with Jeffman on the art and the art of stigma, and how he went ahead and did literally years of research with regard to stigma.
Yeah.
And the results were just so surprising. and how people were really, really quite shocked in what they thought of themselves. So how you would, you would see yourself, and what you would believe in yourself, and then be absolutely horrified as to what actually your thoughts were when came up against someone else. I think that's the main thing, is that people don't never really like to know what they actually think of themselves, do they? And they certainly don't like to know what other people think of themselves.
Yeah. Well, you have to preserve your ego, isn't it? You have to be.
It's narcissism, isn't it? It's plain and simple narcissism.
Yeah, I recommend that aspect for people to read. I thought it applied more, not just to epilepsy or the medical disorders. It's probably anywhere where there's some form of bias, isn't it? Those lessons on stigma apply. So you exhausted a lot of the medical treatments, and you decided to explore alternatives, as you call them. What kinds of non-orthodox things did you experiment with, and did you find them beneficial?
I think that the main thing I found beneficial was taking care of myself, was things like lots of sleep and nutrition, and things like that. Those are the kinds of things which I think were the most beneficial. And I still try and keep those to as much as I can. I drink lots of water. I don't drink alcohol, and I don't drink. I minimize the amount of sugar I take in. So as a result of that, then you by all effects you end up being quite healthy in itself anyway. Obviously, don't smoke. I don't drink any alcohol. Don't that kind of stuff. So, but because of the medication,
Yeah.
you're at a massive disadvantage anyway. I take the dog out for a walk every morning at around 8 in the morning, from 8 till 9. And that's been really, really helpful. But the main thing is mainly rest. I think the only thing that really can work for people with epilepsy is when you have fits. I think there's a tendency to want to go back to your life as quickly as possible, because you feel like your life will just not continue without you, or nothing will continue without you, or it will all fall apart without you, or all of that kind of stuff, and you have to sometimes tell yourself and remind yourself that actually nothing is going to fall apart, nothing is going to die, nothing is going to go wrong, and actually it's worth putting your life on hold for 3 or 4 days in order for you to sleep for 3 or 4 days, to sleep for 3 or 4 days, and then actually do it properly, as opposed to try and just sticky plaster over for a couple of days and then try and do what you can, which is never really going to work, because all that happens is that you end up having more fits. You end up in this bottomless pit that you never really get out of.
A vicious cycle.
Yeah.
I know you said you've kind of been looked at regarding epilepsy surgery. Did you go through the program and they found you are not
No,
sick?
I didn't. I talked about it with my husband and my father and my family and stuff, and we looked at the possibility of surgery and stuff, and we decided that we didn't want to do that. We were kind of continuing with the medication for the time being. So I think we'll continue with that for now. I'm not very confident in the whole process of that.
Okay.
I have 2 teenage sons, and I understand that I could die from a fit tomorrow. I'm not unaware of that, but I'm also not unaware of the fact that I can do a lot better by not putting myself in surgery and putting my life on the line, and by going to them and saying, what do you think about this, and possibly making it a decision that they feel that they have to take responsibility for, which I don't want them to take responsibility for, because it's not their responsibility. They're teenagers, and it's nothing to do with them. It's my choice and Tim's choice, and when the time comes, we'll discuss it with them. But right now, it's certainly nothing that we'll go to them with.
If it's not too broken, don't fix it. Is that it?
Well, it is a bit like that, and it's funny. I mean, you have a house where everything's a bit upside down, back to front, and everything's a bit broken and everything else. But at the same time, you get given a gift, don't you? And you can't overlook that, and you shouldn't overlook that. So it doesn't always make any sense, because you're grateful that everything's gone okay, and at the same time you've just realized that you've had to cancel your holiday because you can't go on holiday because you fell up the stairs, not down the stairs, I might add, fell up the stairs and broke your ankle. It's just these are just all things that you do in the day in the life of somebody who has epilepsy. But I had 12 pins in my ankle, and I certainly wasn't going on holiday. So I just, it's kind of it. But once you get over that, and we were supposed to be going on holiday, I just sort of thought, well, okay, obviously can't go on holiday, so got to see that. And then we had to sort of see what the other side of it, which was, hang on a second, we should just be grateful that we're still here, that I've still got my leg.
A lot of perspective taking to make sense of this situation, isn't it? Otherwise, you can't carry on if you think too much on the negative. We've talked about the reasons you've written the book. Are there any specific lessons apart from what we've talked about that you kind of want a reader to take away from it?
You don't have to have epilepsy to read the book. I think that's the main thing to remember about this book, is that epilepsy is something that you have as a family. It's not something that, so you might be the person who has epilepsy, but your family suffers from it. And I think that's something that you have to remember. My husband married somebody who has epilepsy, but he's been living with epilepsy for 27 years. And my children have a mother with epilepsy. And, we all have something, we all have a stake in it. So I think that was the whole point, was the fact that as long as you have, you say that there is a reason, you have a role to play in this, and that everyone has a role to play in this, and that you see that there's a reason why you might do this. And then there's a second book that's coming out now,
okay,
which is which I think was quite important to do as well, because I think it was more sort of how you could move on this particular angle, and where you could go from this, or where you could, what you could bring from it. Everyone has a role to play in life, don't they? And you have some of us find that role easier than others. And I think this is the role that has been carved out for me, for whatever reason it might be. It wouldn't have been a job that I would have chosen for myself from the beginning. I certainly wouldn't have taken this as a job from the very beginning. I certainly wouldn't have chosen this, but it's certainly it's something that I think that makes sense to me, and it's something that I think I can make sense to others.
And that role of writing and advocacy, is that something you found meaning in kind of in your life? Kind of you've taken this role of writing and educating and advocating. Does that give an added meaning to you as a...
I think it gives a purpose, doesn't it? It gives a reason. As when you find it most difficult, when you find your life most difficult, when you find everything the hardest, then you realize that maybe this is the time that you should possibly pull yourself together and do something about it. And I think that was the way to look at it, and that is the only way to look at it. I think is probably the best way to look at it. I certainly wasn't expecting it to go forward in any other way, but that certainly made sense to me.
Good. Makes well, I'll be looking forward to it to see. Maybe we'll bring you back to talk about that. Are there any other books you would like to recommend, either on epilepsy or the brain, or anything you find listeners might find helpful?
When I was doing the research on my book, the book that I found most useful was Jeffman.
That's on stigma, isn't it?
Yeah, stigma. Yeah, that was the one that I found most useful.
And clearly, I haven't seen stigma explored in such detail, which is quite okay. One to recommend. Any other books?
There was one book. It's called Asylum.
Okay.
And she's called Barbara. I've forgotten her surname now. She was put in an asylum, which was similar to somewhere that you put people with epilepsy, where in like the 1970s. And I came across it when I was doing the research for my book. And I found that book quite interesting to read because people with epilepsy had until the 1970s had been pretty much just been put away, actually. I mean, until the 1980s, very often were just put into mental asylums and weren't let out if they had the first seizure. So I mean, I was pretty lucky. I had my first fit in 1996 rather than any other time, to be honest. I mean, from that point of view, it doesn't help as well, always being compared to illnesses, mental health illnesses. You know, you always get compared to which I don't think is particularly fair, because I you know, firstly, I don't think it's right, and secondly, I don't think it should be done. I mean, people have their own needs and whatever else, and I certainly don't think that you have a right to be compared to anyone, and I don't think you should be. I spent my whole life being compared to and being threatened with being put into the Maudsley, which is the mental health institution of Kings. It takes people, you know, a little while to acknowledge that what they've been doing is not right. And I think it takes a little while for people to people don't necessarily understand that what they've done is wrong.
Yeah, the higher moral ground, I suppose. We all take that. Okay. Franziska Thomas, thank you very much for participating in this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. I've really enjoyed this perspective of epilepsy, which, well, many perspectives I've never considered as a physician, which is quite interesting. To my audience, thank you very much for watching or listening to the podcast. After reading Franziska's book, you might consider going for my book, which is less best-selling, called Surfing the Brain. It also looks at neurology from a layperson's perspective in many instances. But if you want the highbrow neurology, I have a checklist. I have a neurology website called Neuro Checklist. And to make sure you don't miss the next episode of the podcast, why not subscribe to the iTunes, the Spotify or YouTube channels. Until the next episode, thank you very much for your time. And Franziska, thank you very, very much for sparing time.
Thank you very, very much.